I'm Murphy Robinson, the Executive Director for the Department of Public Safety. First, I want to thank the Independent Monitor and his staff for a thorough analysis of the George Floyd protests and riots that occurred this past summer. I want to thank Chief Pazen and the Denver Police Department for the many hours they spent with the Monitor and assisting with this investigation, making sure the OIM had everything that they needed. What makes Denver a special place is our ability to reconcile the differences between a strong and vibrant history and the ability to adopt and own the needed for changes that are necessary. Accountability helps us be a better public safety department. So we will always welcome being held accountable by those we serve. This is why I joined City Council, Mayor Hancock, and Chief Pazen in the call for this report. After reading the final report, I have asked Chief Pazen to respond to each of the 16 recommendations and the projected dates, and have projected dates of completion. We take this report very, very seriously, and we will use it and its contents to remedy policy, operational practices, and hold officers accountable when necessary. The events of the George Floyd riots and protests this summer were unprecedented and was one of the most difficult times in the history of our city. Hundreds of officers that served our city during that difficult couple of weeks served our city well and with integrity. Outlined by the report, though, we have negative incidences and are troubling, and we will work to address each and every one of them. This report will be used as a roadmap to move forward with how we address large spontaneous riots and protests in the future. My office commits to overseeing the implementation of the needed changes, and we look forward to repairing the mutual trust between the police department and the public. I now give the mic over to Chief Pazen for his comments.
Director Robinson, thank you. I too would like to thank the Office of Independent Monitor, Nick Mitchell, as well as his staff for all of their work in putting this very comprehensive report together. It is imperative for us, who consider ourselves a learning organization, to identify the challenges, the gaps that we faced during this unprecedented 5 days. Really, the word unprecedented has been overused in 2020. It's underused when we're talking about the challenges that we faced during this peaceful protest, as well as individual agitators who were involved in violence and destruction. We will use this report. We will use these recommendations so that way we can improve in the future. We welcome the thought process. We welcome the dialogue in order to improve, not only to see what worked and what didn't work here in our city, but also if we can learn from other parts of the country who also faced this historic, unprecedented challenge that was extraordinary in many ways. Thank you.
We'll now take questions. We'll take a few questions if anyone from the media has any.
All right, the first question is from Matt Jablo from Mountain News.
We can. You're very faint, but I think we can hear you. Go ahead, Matt.
So it's important that we talk about the context of this. This was, as I stated earlier, an extraordinary event. It was unprecedented in our lifetimes. It's been decades since we've seen this type of violence and destruction when many were trying to exercise their First Amendment rights. I do take accountability and responsibility for our department's actions. We will use this report in order to improve the areas, the 16 recommendations that we see in this report, many of which we have already begun, but we will use this recommendation. We will also put this on our website as used as a way to share with our community our accomplishing these 16 recommendations.
Next question. Do we have any other questions?
Yes, we do. David Sachs with Dept.
Chief Pazen, there was a lot of talk in the report about anonymity from the lack of rosters on the first floor days and nights to officers not supplying their names or badge numbers. And I'm wondering how you plan to hold people accountable when we don't know who was making mistakes, who was acting inappropriately. Are you going to ask police officers to come forward? How do you deal with that?
David, the report identifies some gaps when it comes to officers displaying their badge numbers. One of the challenges that we faced during these first 5 days were the fact that the protective gear does not lend itself to easily adding body cams. So that's one of the challenges that we faced here. This was an area that was identified, and we also worked to rectify this situation by putting tape on badge number tape on helmets because of the limitations with the protective gear and the thick padding that the protective gear provides and makes it challenging to put those badge numbers on. We have worked to address this concern, and we believe that we have by ordering the badge number tape that can now be affixed to that. We are always concerned with accountability, and there are 50 open investigations currently to address any of the policy violations.
20 independent investigations have been closed because they could not find out who the officer was. So will you be asking officers to step forward?
The investigation process continues, and we will hold folks accountable for policy violations.
20 cases are actually closed, so those aren't continuing. They're closed because they don't know who the officers were. So I'm asking if you're going to direct officers to come forward.
The review process continues to look at this entire situation in totality to include the areas where the Office of Independent Monitor and his report has brought forward additional complaints, so those could be investigated.
Next question from Elise Schmelzer at the Denver Post.
Hi, Chief. To follow up on Dave's question there, have any officers been disciplined in connection to the action of the protest? And after you answer that question, I have a question on a separate topic to get to.
Elise, thanks. I will point out that there was an officer that demonstrated outside of our values with a social media post early on that has been disciplined, severely disciplined. And as are all the cases that move forward, these will be fully investigated. They will be reviewed, and the discipline will be consistent with the disciplinary process that includes the matrix, the disciplinary handbook, as well as oversight, continued oversight from the Office of Independent Monitor.
So besides that, officers
we are continuing to work through each of these complaints. That will be, again, areas where we will share information as we do with our monthly disciplinary reports.
And then I wanted to pivot to a different topic here. Part of the independent monitor's report looks at training. Before May 28th, when was the last time officers went through crowd control training? And then some of these officers, were given cover ball guns without having gone through training, and were given kind of like on the ground, on the scene training. What did that on the ground training look like?
We agree with the officer's recommendation. We need to increase the training with regards to crowd control. Really, the police department has had a long history of dealing with large crowds. We could point to the Super Bowl victory and managing approximately 1 million people in downtown. We could point to the 2017 Women's March, where 10,000 or so folks marched throughout our city safely. We could also point to, as the Monitor does, with the Democratic National Convention and how we were able to manage that situation. Many of these large crowds are areas where you have time to plan and prepare, like the DNC, where we were able to provide training to our officers in order to manage that situation. When we talk about the unprecedented nature, almost this perfect storm that occurred in our city, as well as many other cities across the country, we didn't have the time to prepare. And we need to take this report seriously. We need to take the recommendations, so that way, if there is any type of unplanned or spontaneous event to this magnitude, the magnitude that included violence, injuries, and destruction at the level that we saw really over those first 5 days, then we need to make sure that we elevate that training to include ensuring that we have enough certified, trained officers with the tools that they will be deploying.
So do you know the last time the officers went through crowd control training?
So the officers actually had just gone through refresher training with the less lethal munitions. It was part of first quarter of 2020. And I'll get that exact time frame for you, but I believe it was first quarter of 2020 when we were doing refresher training on those tools.
Thanks, Elise. Next question, Liz Gilardi with 7 News.
Hello, Chief Pazen. I was wondering, the report says that on June 1st, 150 to 200 DPD officers were assigned to the protest, but that DPD only produced body cam video for 38 officers. How do you account for that many officers not having body cameras or not having them on?
Liz, this is an area where we are in complete agreement with the Office of Independent Monitor's report. The limitation or the challenge really surrounded that protective equipment, that protective gear. You may recall seeing officers in what's commonly referred to as turtle gear. It has about an inch and a half thick protective padding. The body cameras themselves, they are deployed utilizing magnets. So on a traditional uniform, you have one set of magnets on the outside, one set on the inside, and that's the retention for the body cam. The challenge was being able to mount those body cams to the protective gear that our officers needed. We had to develop a workaround for that so we could physically attach the body cams to that protective gear. And that's part of the limitations here, but the report also outlines additional areas where we can improve, and we agree with that. We will make those changes so that way we do have body cam footage for all of our officers, supervisors, and staff.
I mean, is that acceptable, especially in a situation like this, when you know that every action is going to be involved into questioning and scrutinized? Is it acceptable for officers to ask how those cameras
Of course, we want to document the officer's performance, and that's one area where body cams have been very useful in identifying the actions of misbehavior or appropriate behavior by our officers. We had significant limitations when putting on that protective gear and being able to mount that body camera to the protective gear. It does not allow that under the traditional attaching system. We had to develop a workaround in order to do that. And I do want to point out that we did not have months leading up to this as we did for the DNC, where we could have identified this type of gap and then addressed it. And I also want to point to the fact that the DNC in 2008, body cams were not part of the department response to these types of situations. So some of those lessons learned from 2008, we didn't, with regards to body cams, we weren't able to bring that specific issue forward. It is a gap. We will and have corrected this. We have figured out how to do the workaround with the body cams as well as the badge numbers, and that is an area that has been addressed and corrected.
And just lastly, too, I was wondering how you plan to better catalog lessons for the future and those munitions that may be used.
Liz, again, we agree with the report. I think the monitor points out some very specific recommendations on how we can improve that inventory. We are in full agreement of that, and we will ensure that that takes place moving forward.
Okay, next question is from Lori Jane Cleha with Fox 31.
Hi, I was going to ask a little bit about, there's references in the report about officers firing upon non-physically resistant protesters or people in the crowd. And then that the use of force forms that are required in the operations manual were vague and often very delayed. So I'm just curious why this was allowed to happen, and I'm also curious why some untrained officers were allowed to use weapons for which they did not have certification or training.
So, Lori Jane, I think that was about 3 questions, right? I'm just trying to. All wrapped into one. Okay. Lori Jane, I think we addressed the training with the certification. We will make sure that officers are properly certified with the tools moving forward. We agree with that recommendation. This was unprecedented. We needed every officer that we could get to try to reduce and prevent the level of violence that we were seeing, the level of destruction that we were seeing. The report talks about 200 arsons that took place in this. The report also talks about the weapons that were involved, firearms that folks had brought to these protests, which made it extremely challenging. We will utilize this recommendation for your point, the training, to make sure that our officers have the appropriate training on the particular tools that they have or need in order to address this. But to the second question that I think was woven in there, when we're talking about the reporting, we have made changes in these crowd situations to do reporting on that same day. I'll use the example where I just talked about the unprecedented nature of this, the long, sustained 12 hours, 14 hours that officers were working in these situations. Under a traditional or a typical use of force that we would see under normal circumstances, the officers involved, the supervisors, they come into the station, they complete the paperwork there, often that takes an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours to complete. We did not have that luxury when we're still trying to keep people safe, when we needed every officer that we could get out in these areas in order to prevent future violence, in order to prevent future destruction that we were seeing. And we have since worked to rectify that situation. We're in agreement with the report. We will make sure that use of forces, and we have since then, are documented on that day and have the appropriate information.
And the last part of that was just why were officers firing at people who are non-physically resistant and only verbally engaging with officers?
That aspect of this is part of the ongoing investigations here. We will hold individuals accountable for violating policy.
Next up is Julia Carney with Different Gazette.
Good afternoon, can you hear me?
Yes, Julia.
Great. I guess my internet went out for a moment, so I apologize if this question's already been asked. But first question, why didn't the department produce officer rosters of those assigned to the protests for, I believe it was May 20th or May 31st?
The simple answer is that this caught us off guard, just like it caught many cities across the country off guard. The level of intensity, the level of violence that we saw here, we have a long, successful history of being able to manage First Amendment activities, get people safely from point A to point B. The level of violence that we saw here really changed that dynamic, and our team was out there for 12, 14 hours and beyond. It's an oversight. It's an oversight that won't happen in the future. It's an oversight that has been corrected with subsequent protests since.
And my other question is that the report also notes some deficiencies in organizing support from other law enforcement agencies to respond in the future. What steps might you take to better organize response from other agencies, in a situation like this with little warning?
Again, we agree with the report. We can and will do better moving forward. We plan to bring metro area chiefs and sheriffs together so we can really dig deep in this, identify. We have to recognize that the spontaneous nature of this is something that could happen in the future. Just because we haven't seen anything like this in decades doesn't mean that we won't see something like this in the future. And it's incumbent on us to take this recommendation serious and do better preparation and training, coordination and communication amongst the potential responding agencies.
Thank you.
Next up is Mo Clark with Colorado Newswire.
Hey there. We've talked a lot about the recommendations that were outlined, and I'm wondering if you could provide some specifics on when we can expect an implementation plan and how we'll make that process transparent to the public.
Mo, thank you. Our plan here is that we will put up a dashboard on our website that will list the 16 recommendations. It'll have a direct link to the Office of Independent Monitors report, and we will list completion of each one of these recommendations. As I stated, many of which we have, several of which we have. The others, we will put timelines to say we will have this done by this month and this year, and then that way the community can see and hold us accountable for implementing the recommendations that the Office of Independent Monitor has outlined.
Next question is from Deborah Takahara, Fox 31.
Hi, thank you. Any idea how much money these 16 recommendations will cost?
I do. I do not have a hard dollar amount for these 16 recommendations. We have implemented several of these. There were some costs associated with getting the Velcro badge number that would then fix to the protective gear. There were some costs associated with being able to apply the body cam to the protective padding. We will work to get that information, and then we will add it to that website if there are costs associated in implementing the 16 recommendations.
I imagine training will be part of that.
Deborah, yes, we agree with the Office of Independent Monitor's report. Again, just because we haven't seen anything like this in several decades, we need to make sure that our teams are trained for any type of spontaneous violent protest, so we can ensure that our officers, our responders, do so in accordance with the policy, both the operations manual policy and the crowd management policy. And we do plan on increasing the hours.
An update on the officers that were injured during this time.
Deborah, thank you. Yes, at least 81 officers in the first few days of the George Floyd protest / riots were injured. We had many officers that were struck with rocks and bottles, explosives like fireworks, officers that were struck by vehicles. We still have officers that have not returned back to work. It is unfortunate that anybody sustained serious bodily injury as a result of this, both community members and officers, and we want to make sure that these recommendations are adhered to, as well as other areas. If we can learn from community members, if we can learn from other cities on smart practices or best practices, so we can reduce, mitigate, and prevent serious bodily injury from anybody with regards to the challenges that we faced back then, as well as any types of challenges we may face in the future.
Thanks, Deborah. We've got Connor with Westport.
Hey, Chief. Question is, what recommendations?
Connor, thanks for bringing that up. Again, I want to commend the monitor and his staff for this very detailed report. I think it outlines much of what we saw with regards to the response and the actions that we saw. I think that it is also important for all of us to recognize the context where we were as a society during this, what led up to this, the divide that we saw in our country, the fear, stress, and anxiety surrounding the pandemic, the fear and stress and anxiety related to economic downturns, that this was the perfect storm. And I don't know if it's possible to put the words on paper to really show the challenges that not only the city of Denver faced on May 28th when we witnessed arguably the most horrific killing, the police violence that occurred in Minneapolis, that impacted all of us. It's hard to contextualize everything that was going on that day that led us to this space. We agree with the 16 recommendations, and we are going to work hard to improve and adhere to the monitor's report in all 16 of them. There's one that's a little bit of a challenge, and that's a recommendation for a metro-wide policy, a metro-wide use of force crowd control policy. But we, as we've discussed, we will work with other law enforcement leaders in the area to identify gaps, so that way we can better address these types of challenges in the future.
Great. Can you just kind of talk about that a little bit more? Why that recommendation for making sure that all the mutual aid partners are operating under the DPD use of force policy is a challenge?
Well, Connor, it's certainly a challenge just because now we would be asking officers from multiple departments to learn our policy, to learn our training. However, we are committed to working with our law enforcement leaders, with the other law enforcement agencies in the metro area. We as a profession want to improve, and this gives us an opportunity to do that. So there's part of this that is beyond our purview. We can't dictate that jurisdiction A or jurisdiction B would adhere to this exact policy, but we will be working together to ensure that we can become in compliance with the recommendations.
Does anyone on the phone have any questions? If you're on the phone and you don't know how to unmute yourself, it's *6. All right, then I think we're going to wrap this up. Chief, Director Robinson, do you have any closing words?
Well, what I want to point out is that the executive director, myself, the leadership team in the city, to include city council, we want to learn from this and ensure that any of the gaps or the shortfalls don't occur in the future. I want to again commend the Office of Independent Monitor, Nick Mitchell, and his staff for the countless hours that they did providing this document that we certainly can learn from. We also need to look at the conditions and how we as a community can ensure that we never have anything like this occur again. The violent protests, we need to make sure that our responses are in line with our values as a city, and this is a step in that right direction. Thank you.